detective, always ask yourself, why does every encounter with James Bond result in the complete demolition, in the complete destruction of the building? In his films, they are flooded, set on fire, blown up, in incredible fireballs, in incredible finales that announce his victory over the villain. Why is it? Why does he have such an incredible anger against the structures and destroy them completely? I will try to analyze the reasons for this in my lecture today. I will also try to speak about the role the villain's buildings play, how they carry the story, how they shed a light on Bond, and of course on the villain, and explain why they just simply have to be demolished and what it all means. Now, with a few exceptions, Bond movies build up to a grand finale in which the villain's lair is completely destroyed while Bond thwarts their evil plans for world domination. The hideouts are either programmed to self-destruct, bombed by 007 himself, bombarded by alien forces, struck by lasers during the final showdown. Why does saving the world necessitate the demolition of the meticulously designed hideouts that display amenities and technology not available to most of us? Is Bond an enemy of modern architecture or architecture in general? A lot of people think so. This is the cover of, of the cultural part of the Basler Zeitung, the Swiss newspaper. 007, the license to demolish, it translates, and they ask that question, so what's his problem with modern architecture? English-speaking newspapers, The Guardian, a very renowned English newspaper, asks the same question. And actually, Steve Rose argues that James Bond is the enemy of architecture in himself. And he traces this back to the original inventor of James Bond, Ian Fleming, who wrote all those wonderful stories. According to Steve Rose, Ian Fleming was very upset when in his street 2 Victorian villas were demolished to make way for this atrocity, a modern building by Erno Goldfinger. Erno Goldfinger, yeah, see, you're getting it. Erno Goldfinger was at that point in the 50s actually a rather famous British architect who, amongst other noteworthy buildings, designed the headquarters of the daily newspaper, Daily Workers newspaper, the headquarters of the British Communist Party, and other buildings like that, and was of course a wonderful kind of person to put on the spot and somewhat to hate. Goldfinger tried to keep his name out of the novels. He tried to force Fleming legally to change the name in vain. As a result, Goldfinger himself, his name got smeared all over the place. He got really associated with this megalomaniac in the movies, and had a very, very hard time as a result of that. Now, this does not really constitute the fact that Fleming had it in for architects, because he loved to do that to other people as well. In Man with the Golden Gun, he vilifies Scaramanga, and Scaramanga happens to be the name of a former colleague at Eton College, a former student at Eton College, with whom he had a falling out when in college. So he definitely carried a grudge and would, vilify those who had ever done him wrong at some point or another. So you better watch it that none of the people in the studio, will ever start writing about you and use you in such a capacity. Blofeld, he is the villain, actually Bond's or Fleming's favorite villain in a couple of stories. He as well went to Eton and somehow had a run-in with Fleming They both were also at members of a very famous London's gentleman's club called Boodle. And I guess that was reason enough to make him a supervillain throughout various movies. Now, Steve Rose firmer also asserts that Fleming had it really in for architecture, that he made scathing comments about modern architecture. However, I was unable to actually verify that. Despite the very colorful writing that Fleming uses in his novels, I could only find two quotes that relate directly to architecture. He describes, for example, the Moonraker base as an ugly concrete world. I mean, we could say that about a lot of things around here. And he describes Las Vegas as the home, and I quote, of a new school of functional architecture, the Gilded Mousetrap School. Well, you know, that's it. You know, I mean, nothing really cries for obliteration, I think. In fact, in his novels, Fleming is absolutely content with letting the villain die, being conquered or whatever by James Bond, and never mentions that the complete leveling of the villain's compound. That is something that is almost exclusively reserved for the movies. At the first brush of the stinking dust column, Dr. No had turned. Bond saw the long arms fling wide, as if to embrace the thudding mass. One knee rose up to run. The mouth opened, and a thin scream came up to Bond above the noise of the engine. Then there was a brief glimpse of a kind of dancing snowman. And then only a mound of yellow bird dung that grew higher and higher. That was the ending in the novel of Dr. No. Dr. No was suffocated under a huge mountain of bird dung. And that was it. End of story. Nothing about nuclear power plants, nothing about meltdowns, radioactive reactor cores or whatever that boil the skin off Dr. No, and so on. So as you saw, there was absolutely no relationship between Fleming's writing and actually the end of the villain. Also, the compound did not have to be destroyed, nothing about it. Now, why is that? Well, James Chapman, who wrote License to Thrill, there are numerous books out on Bond that are, of course, you know, borrowed here and there from. He argues that when you translate a novel into a movie, you, of course, have to do a little bit more work. You cannot just do it rather literally. And here you see on the top, you see the covers of the books. On the bottom, you see the covers of the movies when they came out. So there are various changes that have to be undertaken in the adaptation. First of all, the producers of the movies, they wanted to update the content to make it a little bit more interesting for a younger post-war audience. So they had to kind of spice it up a little bit. They also wanted to make it matter a little bit more. And with Dr. No, which is the first one in 1962 that hit the movie screens, that essentially was somewhat based on the mishaps of the American space program that had quite a few misfires when trying to catch up to Sputnik, and their rockets went off course and exploded and so on. So they tried to take that into account, build it into their story to give it kind of a real now feeling. The other thing that they wanted to do is they wanted to marry somewhat the British spy thriller, which was kind of a, one of those, I don't know, black and white, noble, a little bit slow movies, pre-war kind of movies. Wanted to marry that with the Hollywood love for action and the production values. So they had to spice it up even more. So according to Terence Young, which is Dr. No's director, they felt the need to heat up an otherwise childish grade B thriller. That's what he thought of the writing of the manuscript. He had absolutely no hopes for that film. He said, okay, I have some time left, I need some money, I'll do it. He had no idea that he would essentially create the blueprint for an entire series of 22 movies going almost 50 years. But that's essentially what would happen. As a result, with the introduction of 007 in a dramatic opening sequence, we start generating then later on these mini adventures with fast-paced action stunts and spectacular locations. Now, right after that comes usually the gun barrel scene. You're all familiar with it, with the credits, opening credits, some scantily clad female personnel moving across the screen like this, you know, in a psychic way. What's very interesting here is that, in a way, Bond was not that precisely defined. Look at him. You can't even tell. And this is not because I messed with the picture or whatever. No, this is actually the intro of the very first one of Dr. No. What happened was they used his stuntman for that scene. Sean Connery was not available yet for filming. They used the stuntman, and they used that sequence in the first 2 or 3 James Bond movies till they actually focused on the face of James Bond himself, till the actor himself had some notoriety. The ideal, however, was to keep James Bond a little bit blurry. He was more defined by other things, by his through his actions, through his gadgets, and so on. And they typecast him through ultimately what is called structural oppositions. Those were interwoven in the narrative. What am I talking about? I'm talking like the opposition good and evil, for example, or between the characters. It is Bond against the villain. They are matched, right? It is Bond against the girl, who might turn out to be a traitor, and then there's, of course, then she's going to die, and there's a good girl that takes the place of the evil one, so there can be some resolution in the end and all that stuff. There is an opposition between ideologies. There is, of course, Russia or the Soviet Union at that point and the free world. There is England and the non-Anglo-Saxon world. There is an opposition in values, consumption versus austerity, luxury and discomfort, loyalty and disloyalty. So it is those oppositions that are in every movie, that are essentially the basis of every one of those sequences, and that allow you to plug in another villain, to plug in another Bond in some sort, and still have the same product and the same, continue the franchise and get the audience to simply love it because they know, in a way, what they can get with this. So Bond's persona is foremost defined through his actions, his gadgets, and his stunts. When you look at Fleming's portrayal of Bond, however, his Bond is an essentially conservative hero, a defender of the realm, committed to preserving the institutions and society of his country. He, when not on assignment or at the headquarters, spends his time in the fashionable Chelsea neighborhood. Now, Fleming doesn't mention really Bond's residence, Bond's living quarters in most of the novels. He refers to them very briefly in Moonraker and From Russia with Love as a flat on the ground level of a converted Regency house, but the action always takes place elsewhere. The movies, in a way, follow suit. There are only 2 movies that show you Bond's location. This one here in Dr. No, Bond encounters Sylvia Trench playing sexy golf in his apartment. Can you see her here? Yeah, it's a little bit, yeah. All you see her with playing golf here with a, very short dress of some sort. The furniture, absolutely unremarkable. Kind of old-fashioned, a couple of pictures, a barometer, where here are the pictures with some Model Ts or whatever. French Empire mahogany, a revolving desk chair. Definitely not what we would expect from Bond. Certainly not what we are used by the villains. In the other movie, Live and Let Die, which is the second movie where his place is shown, now we have a different Bond. Miss Caruso, an Italian secret agent, spends the night at James' flat, and when M arrives early in the morning, she kind of has to hide. She comes out of the bedroom, hides in the closet, while Bond introduces M to his new Italian coffee espresso maker. Again, most of the furniture, most of the pieces are kind of retro, share with the other film the combination of French Empire and English mid-Georgian styles that is generally, as my colleague Patrick Snaden told me, associated with man and masculinity. So there we got it, nothing much to talk about. A very poorly defined Bond. Of course, he's never home anyway, so kind of who cares, right? Now, this is in absolute stark contrast to the living situations of his enemy. These are usually very, very far away from everybody. They are hard to reach. They are underwater, like in The Spy Who Loved Me, hidden within a crater in You Only Live Twice. An exclusive retreat high in the Alps, as you see here, on Her Majesty's Secret Service, or remote island, as in Dr. No and The Man with the Golden Gun. Fleming doesn't really describe the hideouts in great detail. However, his sixth novel actually tells us, through the voice of Dr. No, which was the first movie, it's not the first novel, the sequence is different, tells us actually why they are so hard to reach. The reason is Mr. Bond, power is sovereignty. Clausewitz's first principle was to have a secure base. From there, one proceeds to freedom of action. Together, that is sovereignty. I have secured these things and much besides. No one else in the world possesses them to the same degree. They cannot have them. The world is too public. These things can only be secured in privacy. You talk of kings and presidents. How much power do they possess? As much as their people will allow them. Who in the world has the power of life or death over his people? Now that Stalin is dead, can you name any man except myself? And how do I possess that power, that sovereignty? Through privacy, through the fact that nobody knows, through the fact that I have to account to no one. So here we got it. This is why the villain's retreats are so spectacularly hidden away. Why he has to, I mean, imagine what is involved in this. Secret surveys, you know, secret architects that secretly acquire or contract out, secretly acquire all the materials that are secretly shipped to the secret location, you know, way off the grid. I mean, we are talking millions and billions of it, and probably right after everything is finished, you have to kill all those people, because otherwise they would just blab, right? All the construction workers, the contractors, and of course the architects. So think twice before you go that route. The money is not everything. Anyway, so this is very, very different from how we previously expressed our power. We did so previously through axes, through sleek through symmetry, and all those kind of wonderful things. Beautiful, beautiful approaches, linear approaches. We put things on pedestals. We put it high up. We put it into the face of people to be admired, and so on. That is the traditional way all our governments, be they socialist, capitalist, whatever, wanted to admire. They wanted to be right in the face of people. So the villains just go the opposite route. The villains go internal. Rather than going external, they feature sleek surfaces, moving elements, elaborate play of light and shadow. They retreat from the public eye. And of course, what I just described is a perfect metaphor for modern architecture. And so it's not surprising that Steve Rose, the famous critic of The Guardian, argues that what is the archetypical Bond villain if not a modern architect? He compares Hugo Drax's desire to create a new civilization in space in Moonraker and Stromberg's plan to wipe out world cities for an underworld Atlantis in The Spy Who Loved Me to the architects, the modern architects' desire to rid the world of all the historical stuff and start anew. Furthermore, modern architecture, just like Fleming's villains, also does not have a clear national origin. Modern architecture is part German, Czech, French, Russian, Dutch, Swiss, and whatnot. Just like the main villains, there's always a German gene somewhere in one of those villains, you know. Ideally German-Asian in one way or another. Those make the best, I guess, villainist combinations, just like modernism. So we have a really, really nice match here. It's very easy, very understandable. Modernism itself, of course, was introduced to America in the 20s and 30s. And soon thereafter, soon after its introduction, it was perceived already as a frightening sign of progress driven by technological and scientific advance, as it was called. It demanded, obviously, that its disciples start from zero, as the members of the Bauhaus had suggested, while Americans usually loved or wanted to keep up and not supplant the Joneses' way of living. So there was a conflict built in anyway. However, in the beginning, Hollywood, the Hollywood producers, the Hollywood directors, they really ate it up, and they became the main clients of a lot of modernist architecture, buildings by Schindler, Neutra, and John Lautner. So modernism kind of lived an uneasy way, let's say, in America till the Second World War. This should change after the Second World War. Things became much more deliberate, much more decided, when this fear of a nuclear attack, of complete devastation, when this fear was associated with science, with technology, and of course with the buildings by modernists. From that time on, the only modernist building that is a good building is either a factory or an office building, but as a residence, it is absolutely frowned upon because such architecture is reserved for characters who are evil, selfish, obsessive, and driven by the pleasure of the flesh. So the list of modern buildings used for villainistic activities is endless. You know, here I highlighted some of the things for gangster bosses, kidnappers, psycho, teenagers, trash, modern, evil masterminds, lunatics, South African suprematists, porn kings, abusive relationships, dysfunctional murder, crooked, gangster, pornographer, pimp, playboy, psychic, and of course trashed. The ultimate kind of stab at modernism was in Lethal Weapon 2, when Mel Gibson, aided by an American truck, could simply pull a modernist building off its foundation. You know, I mean, look at it. You know, this shows what hobos, what incredibly stupid people we are. We can't even build and secure a building on top of a hill. You know, just one little American truck and its history. Well, we know better, of course. So Hollywood loved and continues to love trashing modern architecture. You see it and you know what you're getting most of the time. However, one of the most famous modernist buildings was, of course, the Van Damme house in Hitchcock's North by Northwest. And that film is 1959. Van Damme, verdammt damned. It already tells you what's going on here. It means cursed, ultimately. And this is where I think it was a Nazi spy meets with a Nazi courier meets with a spy who will hand over some secrets, and then they're going to fly out. So this is the final showdown up there in the mountains near Mount Rushmore, hidden away, hard to get to, just like every other later house that we'll find later villains' residence. So the evil, of course, breeds in those houses that are very, very far away from public scrutiny. However, this building was not designed by an architect. This building was actually designed by a couple of stage designers, and as such, it shares its pedigree with most of the Bond buildings, most of the villain buildings in Bond that are designed by a person called Sir Ken Adam. He was the production designer of almost half of the movies. He was definitely the production designer of the first movie. Ken Adam has a wonderful history. He's German, grew up in Berlin in the time of when Berlin was this incredibly booming city in the roaring 20s. Under Max Reinhardt was there. He was a theater director. It was the time of painters like Gross, Otto Dix, Klee, and Kandinsky, of a lot of new endeavors in the arts, in design, the Bauhaus, and all that kind of stuff. He was the son of a rather eccentric and well-known store owner or department store owner. His father, I guess he had some sort of a sporting goods department store. He also had his own airplane and whatever, so was rather wealthy. And actually, he or the family had Mies van der Rohe design a new department store on Friedrichstraße, which, by the way, is the site of this famous glass skyscraper that you might have seen in many of the history books. So he probably most likely met Mies van der Rohe, who came to their house. He saw the Shell House, which was a very famous new type of office building, modern office building go up in Germany. However, the family was Jewish, had, of course, to leave, got out by 1933, fled to England, made it to England, where they tried to make a living of sorts, which didn't really quite work out. Ken Adam joined the Royal Air Force, and he was the only German flying against Nazi Germany as a pilot. So his brother was also in the Royal Air Force, but his brother had become a British national or citizen. Ken Adam decided to fly against Germany as a German, which would secure his immediate death. He would not be a prisoner, never become a prisoner of war if he would be shot down, but he would be seen as a traitor. So it was kind of extra dangerous to do that. Nevertheless, towards the end of the war, after the war was over, he went to the Bartlett School in London and studied architecture. That's where he met, one of his tutors was an assistant of Erich Mendelssohn, formerly also Berlin, who now practiced in England. And Ken Adam started to do these modernist designs, much to the displeasure of the head of this Bartlett, Professor Richardson, who strongly encouraged him to design in a more traditional Queen Anne or Georgian style. Somehow, Ken Adam made it through school despite being rather pig-headed, and then would gravitate to various jobs till he landed a job as a film designer for Hornblower. I'm sure none of you know that movie. It is about a sea battle. Captain Hornblower was one of those British heroes that fought against the Spaniards, and Ken Adam was asked to design the naval battle for the movies. After that, he did such a good job that he worked for a couple of years as battleship. You know, this old, sailboats or whatever, battleship designer. He worked with Errol Flynn in these pirate movies and all that kind of stuff. So nothing to do with buildings after all. Till finally, in 1961, he had a chance to rediscover his expressionistic roots. When Terence Young hired him as the production designer for the first Bond movie, Young gave him completely free rein. He told him, you can do whatever you want. You just can't spend any money. So isn't it great? You know, we here at DAB, we always get the similar chances. Do what you want. It just can't cost anything. And it was, in a way, it was this incredibly tight budget or fumes or whatever that allowed him to create his most dramatic sets out of almost nothing. Because modernism is all about surface. It is all about a surface material that looks like something, you know, looks kind of noble of some sort, that can be easily done in some foil or whatever. It is sleek. It does not have really much depth in terms of ornament, which is very, very expensive. Maybe it moves, but you can cheat on that. You have just two people, you know, off stage, each with a string that move the electric door forward or backward or whatnot. And you have a really expressionistic lighting scheme, as here in this scene where Professor Dent receives his orders from Dr. No. This was built, they almost forgot about that one. This was built very last minute for £500 within a day or so. And in a way, it recalls actually a design by Mendelssohn, the Delavoir Pavilion in England, that of course Ken Adam was very familiar with. Now, some of Adams' futuristic sets were actually inspired by real structures. Albert Kahn's factories, for one, definitely had an impact on him. However, most of his designs were actually came out of his own imagination. They were essentially what he knew, plus a little bit of an edge in addition to it. For example, in Dr. No, nobody at that point knew how a nuclear reactor looked like. Ken Adam made some sketches based on some books, and then met with a nuclear physicist in New York in a cafe, showed him the sketches and said, well, do you think it could look like that? And the physicist looked over and says, yeah, I guess so. And so we all now think we know how nuclear power plants look like. He pulled that a couple of times. Some of you, the movie buffs amongst you, might recall Dr. Strangelove, or How I Love to Live, no, How I Lived with the Bomb, I Love to Love the Bomb, or whatever the name is, the subtitle. And it, anyway, deals with a nuclear attack on Russia by a crazy general. And all the other army people, you know, the generals and the president, they go to the war room, which is this circular space with all those monitors that show all that kind of stuff. It's a film by Stanley Kubrick. And the design of that war room was, of course, by Ken Adam. When Ronald Reagan became president and was finally allowed to go to Washington for the first time, he immediately wanted to see the war room. Well, they didn't have one. I mean, you can bet on that now Ronald Reagan had one built. You know, he was sure of that. You know, now I'm sure we have one of those secret spaces. Another film he did, for example, another film it's this film it's Goldfinger. He designed Fort Knox, for example, and it was so believable that it created an outcry amongst the American media. They said, how come a Brit with his film team can get into the holiest of our holies, where all the gold is, when even our president is not allowed? Well, they didn't get in. They were allowed one overflight in a little Cessna and took pictures from the air, and based on that built a model and then made up the interior. And when you carefully look at that film, Goldfinger, you'll notice that gold is kind of, you know, that high, you know, one brick on top of the other on those pallets. Well, you can't do that. You can't staple gold that high because of its incredible weight. It would actually melt the bottom layer. due to its weight. But you know, you can only typically you can, I guess, that high or whatever, whatever that is. I don't know how many bars. I don't own that many bricks myself, so I never tried it out. But I think it's something like that. Anything beyond that is impossible. But that didn't look real enough, you know, because you wanted to see all that gold, so it had to be high, you know, over man size. So Ken Adam always kind of tweaks it a little bit to be right at the edge of what is possible, and managed to add to a rational modernist aesthetic a little bit of a sexy futuristic edge. Now, in other movies, such as Moonraker and others, The Spy Who Loved Me, You Only Live Twice, for example, he managed to push this concept further and further. And here you see some of his really incredible sketches, especially in You Only Live Twice. He actually starts to influence the narrative. You Only Live Twice supposedly place, this is about the one with the crater in Japan. The story actually takes place in an old medieval castle in Japan with a poisoned garden. Now, they were flying over Japan with choppers for over a week, and they, the pre-production team or whatever, the scouting team, and they couldn't find a medieval castle to save their lives. There just was no medieval castle. At the end, towards the end of these 2 weeks, they flew over a couple of really cool craters, and Ken Adam said, wouldn't it be cool to have one of those craters as the villain's lair? They looked at each other and said, okay, maybe. They told the chopper pilot, you know, to fly into one of them, which was nearly his end, because it took almost an hour to get back out of it. Because of the downdraft, the engine was hardly powerful enough, but he managed. So after that, they said, yes, let's do it. And they decided on actually having one of those craters built on the soundstage in England, the Pinewood Studios. Terence Young, I think he was the director of that one as well, he gave Ken Adam a budget of $1 million and said, well, just see what you can do. Now, Ken Adam believed that things should be as real as possible, so he didn't believe in these insipid models, you know, that we like to build. He wanted the real McCoy, or as big as possible. So the idea was you had to fly a chopper. The whole of the volcano had to be big enough that you can fly a chopper through, which you see in the movie. And they actually built one of those things for £1 million. It was, I have no idea what this would be today. And they used more concrete on that crater than was used in the entire city of London during that year in construction. So it was definitely one hell of a crater that was built there for that novel. And the entire story then changed based on the production design, which definitely is a victory for the ingenuity of Ken Adam. Now, when we look at the work, when we look at his designs, we see, of course, that he is very, very fluent in the modern vocabulary. We have the strip windows here that we always have in modern architecture. We have the repetition, oops, wrong button. Hey. The repetition of structures here to give us this endless space, to give us this sense of power. Also notice, students, please, no handrails. You don't really need handrails in the movie. They just make everything absolutely ugly. So just leave them out in your project as well. They're nothing, I mean, you know, to be really meddled with. He likes to use nice flush materials. Here you see the copper door, but it's everything is really paper thin. It has to move, of course. The oculus, the monorail, that is about efficiency and all that kind of stuff. So a modern vocabulary that is really prime for the taking. And even I would argue, is Jenny here? No, good. That he was probably one of the first green architects, because when he wanted to do away with some of his underlings, he used natural forces to do so. The piranha pool, for example, where he had biodigested, or whatever you call that. Biotermination, I guess, is the word for it. Or here, this incredible slide into the shark pool. So he was really environmentally very correct and was striving very hard for zero carbon emissions in his designs. Okay, enough of that. Now, the villain, however, looks so much more powerful, right, compared to Bond. The villain has everything. Look at this. You know, this is the man with the golden gun. Gigantic mirrors come out of the mountain, you know, sample the sunlight, collect it, bundle it, and then look at this, what he's doing with it, the fascination of, you know, this built-in kind of thing. Well, James only has a little gadget. However, it fulfills the same purpose. Absolutely. He is much more independent. He can hide his weaponry in everyday objects. And that's what makes it so fascinating. He can take it with him. When the villain's lair is destroyed, all that secretly spent money and that secret construction, everything goes up in flame. When James loses one of his toys or it gets demolished, as we know it always does, he always trashes the car and whatever, he just picks up a new one for the next episode. Or a new watch, he gets a new watch with a new laser and a new whatever built in. So while it looks as on first sight that James is a pauper compared to the villain, actually he is victorious because he's so much more nimble and so much faster, so much more flexible than the villain, who puts all his eggs in real estate. And you know, we know that should ring a bell these days. So we know where actually the action will be. So what is James doing? How is he operating? Well, it's concealment. This is the very first one. Of course, a little plastic dove on the head. This is a stingray cape. Then, of course, changing your identity rather easily. I mean, we know all that kind of stuff. Then it gets much more sophisticated. The hybridization, the watch with a magnet, with a laser, with a communication device of some sort, the sniffer for bugs, and miniaturization, how you can use a big object and break it apart, make it smaller. Those are all the things that should actually start resonating with us, you know, because that is in a way what we're doing. And finally, mobility. Seems to be almost like the new categories where architecture seems to be headed in the near future. And James Bond did it all. Overcomes the limitations of the fixed, of the built-ins, of the gadgetry that can't be taken with you. So in a way, his gadgets guarantee his victory, but they also place him at the forefront, actually, of the design towards concealment, miniaturization, hybridization, mobility. And as we know, I mean, we know Q's workshop. Q, the person who presents him with all the gadgets, and ultimately, you know, what's the difference between that and our rapid prototyping lab? You know, the one-off that we are now capable of generating. It's just a good idea. You don't need a factory. You don't need hundreds and thousands of employees or people in black shirts or whatever that the villain always has. He's always surrounding himself with all these engineers and underlings. You know, they all have the same clothes, and it's a mixture between brown shirts or black shirts and Mao Zedong uniforms or whatnot. You don't need any of that. All you need is one genius and a clever shop that allows you to do all that kind of stuff. Now, we have picked up on that. Architecture, I argue, has really picked up on that. Here is an object of concealment. We conceal sinister actions. This is most likely either a bank or an insurance agency or a governmental office. But we don't know what it is. And we conceal that behind a facade that looks somewhat benign and borrows essentially its image from the street across. We also get, of course, much more sophisticated in that. We conceal ourselves, just like here in the camouflage, behind buildings, we use that technology, like in Copenhagen's concert hall, Jean Nouvel's building, where the facade can change and is giving you different messages at any time. We also continue. We also here, this is a story about the Rapid Prototyping Center. We also are capable of creating buildings, one-offs, incredibly fast, assembling them at absolutely no time, as was shown in the Museum of Modern Art's home delivery fabrication of the modern dwelling in 2008. So we have learned an awful lot from the techniques of James and his applications. Finally, the idea of the laser, the watch with the laser, the saw, the magnet, communication device, detonator, hybrid, and so on, finds its architectural equivalent in the work of a couple of folks like Hans-Peter Wörndl, Patkau Architects, and Jean Gotzel, and the minimal hybrid living environments of Andreas Zittel. So in Wörndl's Gugelhupf the house can actually be pulled apart based on occupation. It starts out with one piece as a block, then you pull out the windows, you pull out the chimneys, you open the entire thing up, depending on the weather, for a party, and when you leave, you close it all up again. So you create, by moving all that stuff out, you create not only interior space, because you clear the stuff, but you also create openings, you allow the light, you allow the air, and so was in, and then close yourself up again when you need to. In this one, the Future Shack, this building, of course, is a container, is again the case of the mass-produced item that hides something completely different. It can, due to its hydraulic legs, be pretty much positioned on any topography. You can even have a ramp on it. It contains a sunroof with solar collectors, then can fold out and can either protect you from the sun or generate the electricity needed. And on the inside, all the furniture is hidden in the walls, can simply be pulled out, like the table here, or the beds, or so on, and can be moved again. So it is a minimalism in a way James Bond advocates. It's something you can almost take with you. It's almost the extension of his little suitcase with the gold, the knife, the explosives, and whatever else he needs to carry. Now in this one, La Petite Maison du Weekend, Patkau Architects provides a similar thing, a box essentially that folds out and creates all the spaces and amenities needed to enjoy the weekend, to have a party at your place, watch a football game, or whatever else it is. And finally, Andreas Zittel's living space, A to Z living unit of the already 1992 to 94. It's a highly compact system that essentially folds out and allows her to reduce her basic living activities to a 200 square foot environment. So now I would argue, based on all of this, I would argue that Bond's contribution to the architectural discourse goes way beyond his relentless destruction of modern architecture. Indeed, he adds another structural opposition to the series' basic formula of good versus evil: the technological gadget versus the architectural setting. He challenges the rigidity of traditionally designed architectural spaces and helps further the case for a more accommodating design approach that incorporates temporal change. As long as the Bond films continue to follow Ken Adams' desire to remain slightly ahead of current technological developments, I believe they will be able to serve as a source of inspiration for future architects. And for those who want to know more, here is the new Bible. It's not small, medium, large, X large, or something like that. It's the films are not enough. Thank you very much. Oh no. Okay. Anybody?
Udo, I'll prime the pump and ask if Victor Hugo said the book destroyed the building. In Bond films, the gadget destroys the modern building. And your thesis is that gadgets will destroy modern architecture.
Yes, I would argue that the building becomes, or retreats essentially to become a container, simply a container that is necessary, but that doesn't really deserve that much of our attention.
That's pretty revolutionary.
So the reason why I'm saying this is that already when you read some of the news, most financial experts at this point argue that investment in real estate, in buildings, is a thing of the past. So if you want to invest your money, your retirement money, don't go that route, because they assume that we won't ever see the returns of our investment. They argue that actually the old dogma of having an owner society, which is something we still follow in the United States very much. We think that anything below 60% owners and 40% renters is kind of anarchy and leads to instability and I don't know what, that this thing is definitely a thing of the past, that we will move towards a renter society, we will be much more flexible, our jobs might be somewhere else, we might have to pick up and move. So what we need actually is some sort of a compartment that we can make our own, that we can individualize in a very short period of time, and that would be done through gadgets in one way or another. And I would count pretty much everything you put within those four walls, and ceiling and floor, the 6 surfaces as a gadget, whatever, piece of furniture or whatever it is. Hank.
Wouldn't another message might be the illusion of film, the illusion of reality, so that what we're seeing in modern architecture isn't really real, that it is being translated into another dimension, so that film takes it. I mean, that's the message of film, is that we're living in this kind of illusion set. And operating within that. I mean, we could go on to other types of films that would be sci-fi films that would really take that idea of this sort of futuristic expansion of space much further. So that, like maybe Blade Runner,
Right.
goes back and forth between a kind of classical building and the whole idea of a city expanding and being controlled by kind of different types of spatial references, so that when you end up where they're sort of driving off and they end up into kind of a sunny countryside.
You could say so. However, I think it's very interesting that most of the sci-fis, in a way, actually go back in time and present us with a 19th century environment. Just like Blade Runner did. The Bradbury building was, I think, late 19th century, 1890s or 80s or something like that. The good ones really shy away from committing to architecture because it looks so much like a set. It becomes unbelievable, when you, for example, in some of the Star Wars films, I guess the later ones, you definitely have with all these sleek kind of organic kind of tower type things. It all looks like a Calatrava building. You really have a hard time suspending your disbelief. So I think it's interesting that they go back in time to stage much more actually of a social future or a narrative future rather than actually a built environment. The built environment is usually falling apart in the majority of those movies. But I would definitely agree with you that most of that, the illusion becomes very important, and it is, of course, on the surface. But if you look around and look at the materials that surround you, I can only argue that this actually proves my case. Architecture has followed suit. we have done away with anything that has a certain depth to it. And actually, whatever we do is relatively shallow. We create relief with the easiest methods we can by just putting another panel on top of something else in order to get any sense of depth. And most of our materials are no longer really very genuine or whatever. They're all covered, they're all composites, and so on, which also at this point actually is even supported, I think, by a lot of the green material kind of craze that asks us to save on a lot of things, and kind of promotes this kind of superficial veneering of some sort. Yeah.
I'm curious to hear about your ideas about the relationship of gender and modern architecture, because to a certain degree, like James Bond is sort of like the masculine, or at least an idea of masculinity. And the spaces, whether it's the villain or James Bond, talks about an idea of masculinity. But how do you think women lay within the spaces? Sometimes they're absent, sometimes they're there, but how do you think the spaces of James Bond talks about femininity or masculinity in general also?
What's a thanks, Edson.
Because the women are there, but
the women are there, but no, the women are not there. It's not about the women. The women are furniture. And I mean, that sounds really nasty, but I didn't make those movies, so don't hold that against me. No, the women are, they are there to make the man look good, to give him, maybe in the later James Bonds, they give him a reason for his outrage and for, to be so hateful, for example. But did he really need that? I don't know. I mean, he would have killed the person probably anyway. So, but they're more there as they serve a purpose. And once they serve their purpose, like a piece of furniture or like a gadget, they are thrown away. Very few of them survive their encounter with James Bond. And it doesn't matter whether you're a good woman or a bad woman. You know, in the tradition in the past, we had this. What was it? It was the goddess, the nurse, and the witch. Right? Those were the three women types used in a lot of history, in a lot of narratives, like all those Western stories. Or the pulp fiction, whatever stories, we had essentially those three types. The goddess was, or the mother was untouchable. The nurse was the one that would kind of heal you and bolster your ego or whatever. And the seductress, the witch or whatever, that was the one that you were truly interested, but you should not have any dealings with. She was usually your downfall. So now I think, at least there, I think we had a tripartite of women. I think in James Bond we only have one set of women, and they're all, just negligible in a way once they serve their purpose. What is interesting about your question is that I had the same question a couple of years ago, and I asked the students to come up with an answer, and that was the studio Patrick referred to. It was called The House for Jane Bond. I argued that the next James will be a Jane, because, I mean, even M is a woman, that was the time when my university president was a woman, my school director all my bosses were women, the associate dean was a woman, the dean was a woman, everything, the entire pyramid were female. And so I thought, hey, even with M is a woman, this is the next step. And really the big question for the students was, is a female spy, is she, what is she? Is she even more brutal and more meaner than James Bond? Does she have to overcompensate to make it in a man's world? Or does she introduce those characteristics traditionally associated with women, the kind of the nurturing? I mean, can there be a nurturing Jane, Bond? I mean, you nurture the villain, you try to convince him of his evil doings. But I don't know. It was really interesting, What was most interesting is that most of the students in that section, they shied away from answering that question. They said, can't we just do something for James? And it didn't really matter whether it was female or male students. They preferred the easy way out. They had a really hard time with that question. We simply don't know. We haven't really seen it yet. There is a spoof, a mad TV spoof that has Claudia Schiffer as Jane Bond, by the way. And it's called Stapled, Not Stirred. And she's an office temp in that one, out for revenge. But yeah, that was the only thing that we could find at this point. So we have to wait till Daniel Craig finally leaves the stage, which might be rather sooner than later. And I don't know who the next woman would be. I mean, who do you think would be the best Jane? Any preferences? Do you know of one? Angelina Jolie, okay. Good, yeah, I'm curious. Anybody else? Yo.
I think in the James Bond movies, there's a third archetype that appears to talk about the villains, modernists, players, and you talk about James's mobility and activity, his lack of a need for architecture. But a lot of the encounters he has with female characters and a lot of kind of supporting architecture that he uses happens to be, I think, a lot more feminine, a lot more culturally contextual, whether it be the hotel he's staying at or the resort spa. Is that kind of, could there be
Like
a play in that?
the third space.
He can't achieve his mission without the use of some of those styles. He needs that. He needs that femininity.
Well, it is the nurturing. Yes, it's essentially where he pampers himself and his mate, where they take a bath or whatever, you know, in this circular, or they are sleeping in this circular bed that is an aquarium with a goldfish swimming around and all that kind of stuff. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, in a way, it's just like those spaces. They seem to be. Yes, they are feminine on one hand, but it's a very superficial femininity. It's not. They are not tied. They don't really have a tie with the female lead, so they are not personified spaces. They are used. They are rented. They are rented spaces. So again, the female serves in this case a purpose, but that's all that's good for, you know. I mean, yes, it's necessary, but it could be anywhere. It doesn't belong to anybody. It's interchangeable. Yes, it's very pricey and whatever, but it's also something that you could, if you had probably $1,000 or $2,000 a night for a suite, you could probably find something like that even, right? In fact, Goldfinger was filmed in a wonderful hotel in I think it was Miami Beach, by Lapidus, Morris Lapidus, and it was a real building. And the production folk, they said this was the perfect set ever, and he became known as the movie designer, Morris Lapidus, which really killed him. He was a very serious architect. He didn't want to be a movie designer, but he did some of the sexiest, really retail and hotel spaces ever. He actually did one, the Bond department store downtown. That was in the Hilton, what is it? Terrace Plaza Hilton Hotel. There was a Bond department store with interiors by Morris Lapidus, and his stuff is, I mean, of the time, it's one of the best designs you can possibly imagine. You know, but yeah, he got typecast as this kind of movie or female or nurturing or whatever architect, and he saw himself as one of those diehard, you know, fountainhead modernists. So it didn't quite jive with his self-image. Yes.
Would you say Bond, from after explaining all this, would you say he's not from a good or bad standpoint, but would he be a villain to your ideas or a hero to your ideas? Where he's all about this modernist, compact architecture, or so? What do you think? Is he good or bad?
Well, he essentially says the end justifies the means, right?
I guess.
That's what he says, and I think that's what we're saying most of the time.
All these elaborate, utilizing buildings,
Yeah.
you just blow them up rather than celebrate them.
Yeah, essentially, because it's no longer the way. It's like, I mean, he shows if he shows something, I think he shows that this form of expenditure is losing out. That's what I'm saying. We can no longer afford it. It's also not competitive. Whatever you invest in something like this, in this secret retreat, can be usually breached by one person or whatever, by very relatively cheap means and singular means. And when you think about it, I think our society is precisely at that threshold right now. That's what we are encountering. Our quest for security takes precisely that into account. We spend billions of dollars fighting wars, essentially pushing our borders way out, way away, preventing something to come into America at huge cost. I mean, alone the scanning and all that kind of stuff, and the uproar that creates, and the delays in travel times and whatever. I mean, if you would do, a cost analysis, it would be mind-boggling. And compare that to a bombing device hidden in a printer cartridge shipped by UPS. I mean, it's like, there you have it, it's dirt cheap. And it almost got through.
So do you think these modernists or international style type city planning things, where they used to have that in futuristic 1960s, they'd show these renderings like the Corbusier, that should all get blown up anyways because it's not really where it's going to go?
Well, I wouldn't say it should get blown up. I just say it's no longer the way to go. That doesn't mean you have to destroy it. No, I mean, he destroys it. He shows us.
Burn it and because of what they realize it?
Beg your pardon? Sure.
Just burn it, the renderings because of what they realize it?
Oh, no, you can always pin. I mean, why burn it? I mean, it's like an old painting. You don't burn a Rembrandt just because you can't paint like that. I wouldn't. I would take it to Sotheby's and sell it, and have a party. So anyway, there was one in the back, my last one. Sina, you had your hand up, or was that just your finger? Mm-hmm. You got me there, yes. Thank you very much. The only difference is that in the good old tripartite, sex was only kind of possible with the witch or the temptress, not with the nurse and not with the goddess. While in James Bond, he essentially has intercourse usually with a good, she also has with the seductress, but he might have intercourse also with actually the good girl, and she dies just like the seductress. So that, I think, is a new spin-on thing, that for the girls, it doesn't matter whether you're good or bad, you're dead anyway. So, and on that note, thank you very much.